What's so frustrating sometimes is that, I mean, it seems like these moral panics, they galvanize the attention and energy among the population so much more than other issues that we would feel are more important, like, the upward redistribution of wealth or whatever, or healthcare.
Right.
So, I mean, why do you think this is the case? Like, this can capture the attention in ways often we cannot. And I mean, is there any hope that that will change?
The public is primed for this, right? Like successive generations of political experience being raised and reared and suckled on moral panic. The only real pretext you have for taking dramatic state action is because it's an emergency. You can't do it just because it would provide everyone with health care, or you can't do it just because it would give everyone a dignified retirement, or you can't do it just because, like, in other words, you have to find that. So the public has been somewhat primed and somewhat programmed to think in terms of those structures of extreme events, grievance, victimization, and making an appeal to the state for help under those kinds of extreme circumstances. Yes, it becomes. I think it becomes self-reinforcing now. I mean, it's there partly because we've never succeeded very well at providing a structure of political activism that was based in vigorous trade unions with social democratic and socialist parties backing it, and then going that route. And you can see that the countries of Western Europe, who've all had vigorous social democratic parties, at least in the past and still somewhat in the present, don't tend to go the route of using moral panic to get things done. But ultimately, we resort to it because it's the way we get things done. How do you build a platform that incorporates broad working and middle class interests in a way that isn't panicked or hysterical or that simply looks at the issues and calmly but insistently pursues real public class interests?
I want to quickly follow up on a comment that you made earlier about moral panics being as American, or perhaps even more American than apple pie. Because, you had kind of alluded to this. We see a lot of the logic of moral panics kind of reproducing everywhere. And when we think about the satanic panic, I kind of feel like the most obvious analog today is like right-wing conspiracies like Pizzagate or like, QAnon, which also sort of zero in on a supposed cabal of pedophiles who are like,
Right.
abusing children and so on and so forth. But because you had mentioned that liberal and progressive reformers often also reproduce kind of this moral panic logic, I was wondering if you could weigh in a little bit about like whether you think moral panics are always an expression of social conservatism, or what is really going on. And again, like talk more about the liberal and the progressives.
Yikes. Well, I mean, the satanic ritual abuse wasn't cooked up as entirely by conservatives. It was collaboratively done by an array of institutional actors, including, educated professionals in the helping services industries, sex-negative feminists were very much involved, and evangelicals were deeply implicated, and especially in their circuits of social workers and psychologists. So often these things are a mix. I mean, it's easy to point to things like QAnon, although I mean, Pizzagate looks like a right-wing conspiracy theory, clearly, and I dabbled a bit in that. I had some tiny little piece in the Washington Post on it because it happened nearby, and all of that. QAnon looks I meet people who are not conservative in any deep sense of the word. They're just ordinary working or lower middle class people. And they have had their thoughts captured to some extent by those QAnon conspiracies, which seem to have washed out in the last several months. If I'm not, I haven't followed it closely. They seem to have washed out a bit, but at their peak, I was always surprised at the people of goodwill that I met who were buying into at least some of those scenarios. I suspect, I suspect that when people feel, I mean, I'm ripping off, the book on paranoid style of American politics, the essay, of course. I tend to think that when people feel that the decisions that affect their lives are made by mysterious, invisible, inaccessible groups or cabals, or, well, let's be clear. I mean, the decisions that affect our lives are made by people we can't see, we can't touch, we can't be in the same room with them. Like, we know that the decisions that affect our lives are made by private interests in closed rooms and so on. Right. All right, so I suspect that this is one of those background things, like when mysterious people are making mysterious decisions that we don't get to see or have any impact on. The mind tends to be susceptible to conspiratorial scenarios, and some of those conspiracies get loonier and loonier. Pizzagate and QAnon being just hallucinatory, basically. But liberals also use panic scenarios. Liberals also use very similar techniques, and of course, liberals will give you numbers usually, or they'll bring in an authority figure to back it up, and they'll cite this or that. But in the end, liberals also tend to use similar techniques in a variety of ways. And some of them are murky. Look, some of the background issues are very real, right? Like, we should be concerned about things like child abuse. We should be concerned about whether children are having their welfare looked after. We should be concerned about cases of sexual abuse. So when these things enter into public campaigns, however, in the US, they tend to take on the panic form. And there is a difficult proposition to straddle. The people who were saying, but you have to believe the children. We believe the children. I mean, they undoubtedly had the children's interests at heart. But their thoughts have been hijacked by these highly exaggerated and extreme kinds of scenarios.
And so much of our political discourse today is driven by the culture wars. And I mean, what parallels do you see between the culture war and these moral panics?
Yeah, I don't. Well, you almost have it happening in a weird left-right echo chamber in some ways, don't you? So conservative figures made lots of hay. And the moral entrepreneurs associated with anti-gay backlash in the 70s and 80s made lots of hay with moral panic, right? And it's hard to look at any of the culturally conservative backlash politics without seeing a moral panic behind it, right? The trans women in bathrooms business almost invariably comes down to panicked narratives. And again, like the favorite technique seems to be to find one instance of something that happened and then turning this into the national case. But if you know, again, if we see that conservatives take singular instances of extreme abuses or extreme cases and make their argument around it, we also have to look closely maybe at how liberals fashion some of their arguments and whether they're doing something similar. And as I mean, Jen, as you know, and Paul probably knows, right? I mean, I wrote with the non-site people on the policing crisis and getting decent numbers here, getting good numbers here, getting solid numbers here is very important. But again, the agitation, rightly, around highly inflammatory police killings of Black men produces great agitation and great emotion. And again, anyone watching any of those videos or anyone reading any of those accounts should be upset, offended, incensed, angry, and what have you. But the technique leaves a lot of stuff untouched, right? I mean, the technique, it turns out, isn't a very good one for having the kind of redistributive politics that you would need to see to gradually bring down crime rates in the US, to bring down police killings in the US, and so on. And the techniques, the poster child technique, as I call it in the book, right? The poster child technique also leaves unaddressed about 80% of the police killings in the US, which are not of African-American men. Mm-hmm. So you have to wonder at the use of panic techniques by our liberal, sometimes allies, right? Mm-hmm. And does it have the possibility of bringing into existence a coalition that will affect social inequality in the round? Or does it tend to go down a path that's easily captured by corporate interests and by elite schemes for the kinds of diversity that you were talking about, Jen, in the magnet schools, which is to say, we'll have this fine veneer of diversity at Harvard and Yale and at certain schools and so on. But what we won't do is to take measures that affect the well-being of the masses of working class people who are disproportionately Black and Latino. So I feel like you'll get hate mail over what I just said. I'll probably get hate mail over it. It's okay,
we're used
right?
to it.
Yeah.